I'm going to start by giving you about 25 minutes to read the 10 pages up on the board out of your book. Pause the video and hit play again in about 20 or 25 minutes. Start out with a discussion about interest rates. The nominal interest rate is like the interest rate that you see when a car dealership is like 3% APR. The nominal interest rate is what's reported, and it's not corrected for inflation. Right? It's the interest rate that you pay when you pay a bank on a mortgage or a student loan. What's more important than the nominal interest rate is the real interest rate. The real interest rate is corrected for inflation, right? Or the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. So here's a graph of nominal and real interest rates over the last 45 years. And you can see that the nominal interest rate and real interest rate both move, but most important to understand is the gap between the two. So when the gap between the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate is really, really big, those are times of really high inflation. When the gap is smaller, as it's been in recent years, that means that the inflation rate is relatively low. Today we're going to talk about the three tools that the Federal Reserve has in their toolbox. These are the three ways in which they control the money supply in our economy. The first is through open market operations. The second is by changing the reserve requirement. And the third is by changing the discount rate. And I'm going to go through all three in detail. The Federal Reserve sets the money supply, or the quantity of money available in an economy. That's the money supply, which is the quantity of money available in an economy. In terms of the three tools, the one the Fed uses the most is through open market operations. Open market operations, which is the buying and selling of U.S. government bonds. The Federal Reserve buys and sells U.S. government bonds through open market operations, and that allows them to control or change the money supply at any given time. This is the most important and most frequently used of the three tools. This slide is really important in understanding how buying and selling affects the money supply. If the Fed wants to increase the money supply, the Fed buys bonds from the public. And that makes sense because if the Fed is buying the bonds, the Fed, at the end of the exchange, the Federal Reserve gets the bond and the public takes the money. So there would be an increase in money available to the public. So to increase the money supply, the Fed buys bonds. If the Fed wants to decrease the money supply, the Fed would sell government bonds to the public. Again, makes sense because at the end of the transaction, the Federal Reserve takes the money from the public out of the money supply, and the public would have the bond. So there's less money, or decreasing the money supply. The second tool, which also happens to be the second most often used, is the discount rate. The discount rate is the interest rate the Fed charges banks for loans. When banks need money, they go to the Federal Reserve. Banks behave much like people in that if the Fed increases the discount rate, that would decrease the money supply because when it's more expensive to borrow money, banks do it less. And decreasing the discount rate increases the money supply because when it's cheaper to borrow money, Banks do it more. So to decrease the money supply, they increase the discount rate. To increase the money supply, the Fed decreases the discount rate. The third tool the Fed has is the reserve requirement, or the reserve ratio. Remember from earlier this week that the reserve ratio is the fraction of deposits that a bank must hold as reserves. The Fed can influence the money supply by changing the reserve requirement, because remember, the reserve requirement dictates how much money a bank is allowed to loan out. The reserve requirement dictates the money multiplier. We said that the money multiplier is equal to 1 divided by the reserve ratio. So if the reserve ratio was 10%, the money multiplier would be 1 over 0.1, or 10. If the reserve ratio were 20%, the money multiplier would be 1 over 0.2, or 5. If the reserve ratio were 50%, it'd be 1 over 0.5, or 2. This means that under those different scenarios, one new dollar could create 10 new dollars using 10%, 5 new dollars using 20%, or 2 new dollars using 0.5%. So obviously changing the money multiplier is going to change the amount of money that's created. This tool shows up on the test the least and is also used by the Federal Reserve the least. But by increasing the reserve requirement, that decreases the money supply, because increasing the reserve requirement drives down the money multiplier. Decreasing the reserve requirement increases the money supply, because it would make the money multiplier be a bigger number. The reason this tool is used the least is because it is the most inaccurate. While the Fed can dictate how much money a bank has to keep, the Fed doesn't control two important things that lead to money being lent out. The Fed does not control the amount of money that households choose to hold as bank deposits. So if we decide to take more cash out of the bank, that decreases the amount of loans that a bank can make. The Fed doesn't control that at all. The Fed also doesn't control the amount of money that bankers choose to lend. Remember, the reserve requirement is a required minimum. So with a reserve requirement of 10% or 0.1, that is a money multiplier of 10, but again, that's the minimum. Banks are allowed to keep more, and the more money that banks keep in excess reserves, the more it drives that money multiplier down. So the reserve requirement is a tool that they have, but they don't use as often. The two tools that the Fed uses most often are open market operations, buying and selling of bonds, and changing the discount rate.